This morning, Dr. Fred Johnson, our favorite instructor, will lead us to the end of the Great War. It's his final session on this topic, and I know that Stan and I have learned a lot during the past 3 sessions, and we're looking forward to
The fact that you move around the whole time.
learning more. Am I not coming through?
You're coming through fine. She is a terrible.
So the final class today is called When the Bill Came Due, and the years are 1918 1918 through 1921. And I think we should congratulate, before we start today, Dr. Johnson on his 20th year of teaching. This is quite an anniversary for him. So we should congratulate him, and maybe he can't see our hands, but we should give him a round of applause for 20 years teaching at Hope.
Thank you very much.
And over to you, Dr. Johnson.
Thanks, Kit. Good morning, scholars of HASP. Like Kit pointed out, this is our final session of World War I. It's part 4, When the Bill Came Due. And I entitled this When the Bill Came Due for a number of reasons, mostly because like any conflict, and especially with regard to World War I, there was a tremendous price to pay for what humanity did to itself, what humanity did to the future generations after the war ended. So let's get at it. We have been leading up to the fact that in 1917, there was a crisis in Russia. Now, at this point, Europe had been at war for 3 years, and things had not been going well in Russia, not at all. For example, in 1914, as this picture shows, it was a sign of the poor fortunes to come, of the declining fortunes of the Tsar's army. 15,000 Russian prisoners in German hands at Augustau. If you take a look, this is a picture of Russian peasants before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Consider this, that the majority of people in Russia in 1917, that the majority of people in the future Soviet Union lived like this. And this picture coming up, this one of Russian children in the Volga, deserted by their parents who could no longer stand to witness their demise due to starvation. So children who have been abandoned by their parents because the parents just did not have the human stamina, the emotional stamina to watch their children slowly starve to death. Things were desperate in Russia, and things had been desperate in Russia for a long, long time. So you can imagine that when people understood that, and as I've said on occasions, people may not be as well educated as some other people are, but it doesn't mean that they're stupid. Russian peasants knew that something was rotten in the situation and that they were living the way they were living, but at the same time, the Tsar, the leader of the country, was living in not just opulence, but extravagant opulence, in spectacular opulence, in ridiculous opulence, while Russian peasants' children were starving. Enter a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. The thing that turned Vladimir Lenin, who was just another disgruntled Russian revolutionary and a follower of Karl Marx, the thing that turned him for just being another one of those kind of individuals into a lethal ideologue and determined adversary of the Tsar and the Tsar's regime was the fact that some years earlier, the Tsar's secret police had arrested Lenin's brother and jailed him and then killed him. In that instant, Lenin went from being just another disgruntled revolutionary into somebody who had become a force of history. Like I said, he was a follower of Karl Marx. He believed in the Communist Manifesto that Marx wrote published in 1848, and the admonition from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, was something that Lenin took to heart, and the revolution was underway. These are some of the this is a typical revolutionary romanticized poster of Lenin speaking to the people. This is the actual Lenin speaking to crowds of Russians who had just had enough. In addition to the poverty and the fact that the war was not going well, those same Russian peasants, so many of them who had been dragooned, that is, conscripted into the army, they quite frankly did not know how the conflict had anything to do with them. Now we come to Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky, also known as Lev Davidovich. Leon Trotsky was the force, he was the fire, he was the intellectual spirit of the revolution. When the Russians had their revolution in 1917, there were people inside of Russia, of course, who were opposed to the Bolsheviks, and soon thereafter, a civil war broke out, and it lasted roughly from 1918 to 1922. The Bolsheviks were not doing all that well in the beginning, and it was Leon Trotsky who invented something, or should I say, he created something that was known as the Red Army. Now, we all know what the Red Army is. To my knowledge, the Red Army is still existing, or at least the descendant of the Red Army is still existing in the Russian armed forces. But that Red Army was created by Trotsky, was organized by him, led by him, drilled by him, and it became a potent fighting force in the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922. You see here Trotsky reviewing Red Army troops. 1922, when the Soviet Union was finally established. On March 3rd, 1918, the Russians signed with the Germans the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is the treaty that took Russia out of World War I. And this is a turning point, because what this did was it allowed the Bolsheviks to stop concerning themselves with fighting on the Western Front and turn their attention eastward, that is inside of Russia, to consolidate power, to crush all opposition, to continue spreading the revolution, and to basically consolidate what they were doing. This map right here shows that the Russians lost a significant amount of territory. In fact, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which had been negotiated by Trotsky, among other things, they lost Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, also known as the Baltic states. In 1922, 1923, Lenin, on the left there, seated beside Joseph Stalin, who will become one of the most incredible murderers of the 20th century. Lenin began having a series of strokes that left him, of course, weaker and weaker and weaker. In 1924, Lenin passed away, and a power struggle arose between Trotsky and Stalin, which Trotsky lost. He was eventually expelled from the Communist Party and then found it necessary to flee Russia. Trotsky fled Russia and ended up in Mexico City and spent the next 16 years there still writing and speaking out. But such was the nature of Stalin's paranoia, such was the nature of Stalin's intent to make sure he could consolidate power and have no one's voice heard but his. He sent a spy to track down Trotsky in Mexico City. And after all, Trotsky was not doing all that much to hide himself. But in 1940, this spy planted an ice pick in Trotsky's head, which understandably led to his final demise. What was the world in for with Joseph Stalin now as the supreme ruler of the Soviet Union? I think Stalin's own words speak for him. His given name was Joseph Vissarionovich Jugashvili. He was from Georgia and Russia, but he gave himself the name Stalin because he wanted to be Joseph Stalin, also known as Man of Steel. Consider these statements from Stalin, or what I call Stalinisms. It is enough that the people know there was an election. The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? Death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problem. I don't know about you all, but those statements right there give me about as much of an insight into Stalin's mindset, his view on things, as I ever want to have. The Americans came into World War I on April 2nd, 1917. April 6, 1917. And it was an immediate shot in the arm for the Allies. The American military, which was known as the American Army, which was not the US Army that we have today, it was called the AEF, the Allied Expeditionary Force. And they arrived there with fresh troops. They arrived there with energy. They arrived there with all kinds of ideas. The French, who had been getting hammered during the war from 1914 all the way to the very end, French leaders thought they were going to take these American soldiers and just throw them into battle and do what they wanted. But the American general, John J. Pershing, had some different ideas. Pershing took command of the troops and made it quite clear and very quickly to his French counterparts that these American soldiers were not going to be just cannon fodder, that they would be used in the battles, of course, but they would be used under American leadership and American guidance. The final year of the war, 1917 into 1918, was just as brutal as the rest of the war had been. The United States had been brought into the war because, as I mentioned to you all the last time, the increasing anxiety, hostility, then outright rage of the Germans using unrestricted submarine warfare. People of the early 20th century, still with this 19th century mindset of what was fair and honorable in war, and what was despicable and dastardly in war, all those things from the 19th century began to blur and dissipate as the war went on. And by the end of the war, it became quite common, in fact, even expected, that the Germans and other powers that had the equipment to use blimps for dropping bombs on people, for using submarines, for using mines. And so the nature and culture of warfare during World War I changed from a 19th century ancient regime, so to speak, into a more updated 20th century version of lethality, brutality, and inhumanity, just in time for the 20th century. The conflict ended on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The surrender document was signed by German military officials in a railway car at a place called Compiègne in France. That railway car would subsequently be turned into a museum piece, a place, an enshrined place of honor and pride for the French, understandably, after all that the French had lost. Of course, they would commemorate the place of the scene of their victory, or where the Germans finally surrendered. But that same railway car will become very important at the very beginning of the next war. We'll talk about that when I do a class on World War II. This is a romanticized version of the surrender document. You can see there the German official in the spiked helmet, which was commonplace for the German military, part of the Prussian tradition of Imperial Germany. And Marshal Foch was standing there, another depiction. And this is an actual picture of Marshal Foch there in the foreground, holding that briefcase thing. Look, that briefcase looking like item, and the sort of square cap with a round cap of the French army. And as it says here, Compiègne, the railway car that they're standing on and standing in front of, victorious allies at the surrender ceremony. And then came time for the cleanup. All of the bodies that had been thrown and smashed and blown across Europe. Cemeteries that had to be just established right where they were, because the cleanup, imagine the cleanup of the bodies, human and animal, whole towns and villages that have been just wiped from the earth. World War I mean, when the dust began to settle and the smoke began to clear, and people finally had time to sit down and think about what had just happened to them, what had taken place, what they had brought upon themselves, what they had participated in, what humanity had inflicted upon itself. It was the beginning of a long season of reflection, disillusionment, change that left not just Europe, not just the participants of that generation, but all of humanity would never be the same. And indeed, since then, we haven't been. As I mentioned to you all in an earlier session, the way one of my students put it in the history of US foreign policy class, the general horrors of war were already present in 1914. But what happened in World War I was that humanity found a way to invent new horrors to add to the old ones, which of course just doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled the standard horrors and barbarity of war. So there you have it in Belgium, France, Luxembourg, all across Europe, the dead in Russia. Part of the cleanup necessarily involved peace negotiations, or were they peace negotiations? More or less like a conference of the winners. What are we going to do now with the mess that has been created? And how are we going to stop it from happening again? So the leader of for the British was David Lloyd George. The leader who attended the Paris Peace Conference, the Versailles Treaty Peace Conference in 1919, was George Clemenceau. He had a nickname he was known as the Tiger for a very good reason. Very good reason. Clemenceau was a tough customer and he loved France. And after what he had seen happen to his country, he was in no mood to talk about clemency or grace or mercy. And Vittorio Orlando, who was there for Italy. Italy had started out on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians at the start of the war. But in 1915, they more or less came to their senses or decided that being on the side of the Germans and the Austrians was not a good bet. So they switched and allied with the Americans, well, not the Americans, but the British and the French. And then there was Woodrow Wilson, the leader of the Americans, the American president, who arrived in Europe as, frankly, a conquering hero. Because many people looked at Woodrow Wilson and the United States as it had been that final push. It had been that fresh breath of energy from a young United States, a nation full of resources and manpower that came to help them give the final knockout blow to the Germans and bring that cataclysm to a screeching halt. Woodrow Wilson, 28th president of the United States, arrived in Europe with a plan. He said, "We entered this war because violations of right had occurred, which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible unless they were corrected and the world secure once and for all against their recurrence. What we demand in this war, therefore, is nothing peculiar to ourselves. It is that the world be made fit and safe to live in, and particularly that it be made safe for every peace-loving nation, which like our own wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world as against force and selfish aggression. All the peoples of the world are in effect partners in this interest." Now, let me pause for a second. As Wilson is speaking these words, the French are listening to him, the Germans are listening to him, the French are listening to him, the British are listening to him, but especially the Germans are listening to him. And it sounds like with the American president and the American nation that now have a lot of clout and influence in the world, World War I was kind of like the United States coming out moment. It's no longer not just a large power, but it assumed the status of being a great power. Britain and France had been significantly weakened. Russia was in chaos with the Civil War in 1918, 1919. So America now has emerged as this savior nation with all this energy, all this resources, all this money, all this power, and the American president is carrying that with him to Europe, to the peace conference. And so his words, like all leaders, carried some weight. And it sounded to everybody like Wilson's asking for a reset. We know that this has been a terrible thing, but all nations can come to the table and sit down and speak against force and selfish aggression. All the peoples of the world are in effect partners in this interest. And for our own part, we see very clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. The program of the world's peace, therefore, is our program. And that program, the only possible program as we see it, is this. Here was his proposal. Wilson's talking about no blame, no shame. We're all in this together. We all did this together. There'll be no victor's justice. What he wanted was the adoption of his 14 points, some of which I won't read through them all. You all can see them. But something like this: reliance on open diplomacy rather than secret agreements. Why? Because before the war, there had not been open diplomacy. There had been too many secret agreements. The reduction of the military forces and/or weapons. Why? Because before the war, there had been an arms race and a spectacular increase in the number of soldiers and Great Britain, and France, and especially Germany. Austria-Hungary will receive fair treatment for fair development countries, and the independence for the state of Poland. And this last one, Wilson wanted there to be the formation of a League of Nations to guarantee independence for all countries, large and small. It was on that last point, the last one, the League of Nations, that was deepest and closest to Wilson's heart. Of all of the 14 points, that's the one that he wanted the most, because he sincerely believed that if nations could come to a place and sit down and talk out their differences, to talk out their disagreements, obviously talking them out and reaching resolution would be far better than going to war for 4 years and having as the price that we pay 10 million dead and then some. It wasn't a bad idea. As I mentioned, it was the 14th point. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small alike. Let me revisit that just a little bit longer. Consider the language. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants, that is, agreements, not agreements, but covenants, where people pledge something deep, a guarantee, more than just a gentleman's handshake, more than just a gentleman's agreement, something of a blood oath even, where for the purpose of doing what? Affording mutual guarantees. You protect me, I protect you. We both protect our neighbor. Mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity. The very things that had been violated before World War I and the very things that had surely been violated during World War I, to great and small alike. It sounds like the world that Woodrow Wilson is envisioning must have been on another planet to people. But after what they had been through, after seeing all that had happened, that new world sounded a lot better than the old one that they had inhabited. In fact, that old world was the very world that had failed them and brought the war on in the first place. Wilson said, for such arrangements and covenants, we are willing to fight and to continue to fight until they are achieved, but only because we wish the right to prevail and desire a just and stable peace such as can be secured only by removing the chief provocations to war. In other words, let us remove the causes of war, and maybe you can't guarantee it, but it will minimize the possibility of war. Now watch this. This next language is going to be very problematic when the conference finally convenes. The president said, we have no jealousy of German greatness, and there is nothing in this program that impairs it. We grudge her, that is Germany, no achievement or distinction of learning or pacific enterprise, such as have made her record very bright and very enviable. In other words, we don't want to keep Germany from doing anything that will make Germany great. When the Kaiser came to power in 1898, one of the first things he said was he wanted Germany to have its place in the sun, like the other colonizers, like Britain, like France, like Imperial Russia. Germany deserved its place, and Germany went out and got some colonies and began building a big navy. Germany did get great. Germany was already great. So Wilson's saying, like, listen, Germany, you want to be great? Go on and be great. And we don't begrudge you anything. And then he goes on to say, we do not wish to injure her or to block in any way her legitimate influence or power. We do not wish to fight Germany, either with arms or with hostile arrangements of trade. If Germany is willing to associate itself with us and the other peace-loving nations of the world in covenants of justice and law and fair dealing. In other words, Germany, we welcome you into the family of nations. We want to be partners with you. We want to sit down with you. We want to trade with you. We want to treat you fairly. All we require is that you only accept a place of equality among the peoples of the world, the new world in which we now live. The old world had been literally blasted away, and the new world in which we now live, instead of a place of mastery. So Germany, instead of wanting to dominate people, instead of wanting to dominate us, instead of conquest, we simply want you to agree to be one of a number of co-equal partners internationally. Boy, it sounded really great. So they traveled to the conference, and things got underway. And then this happened. the Allies insisted that the Germans sign this thing or agree to this part of the Versailles Treaty. Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty, also known as the War Guild Clause, which, as you can see, stated the Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. Try and imagine the absolute stun of the German delegation when they get to Versailles and see this. Here's Wilson, who's been crowing about equality and fairness and no victor's justice, and everything's going to be equitable. There'll be no blame. There'll be no shame. And then the German delegation gets there, or over the course of time, they find out they're having shoved down their throat that they started the war, because from their memory, the war started because a Serbian national assassinated a royal from Austria-Hungary, and the Austro-Hungarians mobilized against the Serbians, which caused the Russians to mobilize. When the Russians did that against the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans mobilized. So yet it seemed to the Germans that there was a lot of going on in those days, and yet they had a significant hand in it, but so did the Russians, so did the French, and so did the British. And from their way of thinking, that actually it had been the British guarantee of Belgian neutrality based on a treaty back in 1839, when that finally was recognized and agreed to, and the British had lived up to their treaty obligation, that was the final brick in the wall being knocked out that caused the whole wall to fall. So the German reading on this was not vastly different, but different enough to where they found Article 231 to be repugnant in the extreme. And this began causing problems, especially in light of what Wilson had been saying. The Germans we ended up losing territory. They lost the Rhineland, they lost the Saar, they lost Alsace-Lorraine. The leader of the German delegation, Count von Brachtorff-Ransau, said the following when he was stunned by what his delegation was being forced to sign. He said, "We came to Versailles in the expectation of receiving a peace proposal based on the agreed principles. We hoped for the peace of justice which had been promised to us. We were aghast when we read in documents the demands made upon us, the victorious violence of our enemies. The more deeply we penetrate into the spirit of this treaty, in other words, the more we read about this, the more we think about what we're being asked to sign, the more convinced we become of the impossibility of carrying it out. The exactions of this treaty are more than the German people can bear. We came here thinking that all that friendly talk, all that egalitarian talk, all that equitable talk that Wilson had been giving us, we thought that was the way the negotiations were going to go. So we were utterly flabbergasted when we read this. And the more we think about it, the more we consider it, the more we ponder it, the more we read into this, we simply can't do this. The German people will not stand for it. The German people cannot bear this." Well, Count von Brachtorff-Ransau was perfectly free to disagree with the demands being made upon him and the German people. But then came George Clemenceau, the leader of France, the same France that had been so traumatized for 4 years, the same France where villages and towns had been blown into non-existence, the same France where those artillery barrages that we talked about the last time had happened on numerous occasions. And we said that those artillery barrages sometimes lasted for days, just wounding not just bodies, but spirits and minds, leaving people utterly non-functional for days, weeks, years. People having their faces blown off. That's what we talked about Anna Coleman Ladd last week. People that needed reconstructive surgery, people who would never be the same again. George Clemenceau, the tiger, had seen all of that. And his response then to the German delegation was as follows. The protest of the German delegation shows that they utterly fail to understand the position in which Germany stands today. In other words, okay, you said what you said, Now let me explain what reality is to you. You seem to think that Germany has only to make sacrifices in order to attain peace, as if this were but the end of some mere struggle for territory and power. Dear Germany, that was in the 19th century. That was before. This is called now. In the view of the Allied and associated powers, the war that began on August 1, 1914, was the greatest crime against humanity. There you go. There's that phrase. George Clemenceau in 1919 is using a phrase that sadly has become too familiar with all of humanity. A crime against humanity. The war that began on August 1, 1914 was the greatest crime against humanity and the freedom of peoples that any nation calling itself civilized has ever consciously committed. So it's one thing for the war to begin, but Germany, basically what Clemenceau is saying, you intentionally inflicted this universal misery onto everybody. And so Germany, you can't expect to get the usual treatment of a vanquished combatant. This is different. Because the war was different, the peace is going to be different. For many years up to the war, the rulers of Germany, true to the Prussian tradition, strove for a position of dominance in Europe. They kept Europe in a ferment by threats of violence. In other words, the Germans were always doing something to keep people on edge, to keep things stirred up, to keep trouble going on. They wouldn't let people just rest in peace. And when Germany found that their neighbors were resolved to resist their arrogant will, they determined to assist their predominance in Europe by force. So once people decided to stand up to Germany, then Germany went from just threatening and got ugly, actually brought war. Clemenceau went on. Germany's responsibility is not confined to having planned and started the war. She is no less responsible for the savage and inhuman manner in which it was conducted. They were the first to use poisonous gas, and they were. We talked about Fritz Haber. They began the bombing and long-distance shelling of towns for no military object, and they did. They commenced the submarine campaign with this piratical challenge to international law. Even in 1919, Clemenceau, born in 1841, is still trying to wrap his mind around the fact, how is submarine warfare a legitimate form of war? Well, it was, George Clemenceau, but it was still something dishonorable about that to someone who grew up in the 19th century. They drove thousands of men and women and children with brutal savagery into slavery in foreign lands. They allowed barbarities to be practiced against their prisoners of war from which the most uncivilized people would have recoiled. Germany, you did something that was so heinous, so barbarous, even the so-called uncivilized people of the world would not have stooped this low. Clemenceau is making it plain that it would have been bad enough if Germany had started the war, but the way they fought the war, that's what was truly insulting. That's what was truly offensive. The way they had fought the war was such unleashed, such just incredible cruelty, as if the war wouldn't be cruel enough all by itself. The conduct of Germany is almost unexampled in human history. The terrible responsibility which lies at her doors can be seen in the fact that not less than 7 million dead lie buried in Europe, while more than 20 million others carry upon them the evidence of wounds and sufferings. Look at that language. While 20 million others carry upon them the evidence of wounds and sufferings, because Germany saw fit to gratify her lust for tyranny by resort to war. Past scholars, we need to remember that those 20 million who have suffered have evidence of wounds and suffering on them. They're going to live into the 1920s. They're going to live into the 1930s. There'll be living reminders for the next 2 decades of why it's a good idea not to do a world war. And it's going to also be a living reminder that when another thug comes into power in Germany, while the world is going to be so deathly afraid of possibly doing a second time what they had done the first time. Clemenceau kept writing, the Allied and associated powers believe that they will be false to those who have given their all to save the freedom of the world if they consent to treat this war on any other basis than as a crime against humanity and right. All those millions of people who have suffered and died, and those who are suffering while they live, we would be doing a severe injustice to them if we just treated this as business as usual. So Germany, Clemenceau says, this is not business as usual. The Allied and associated powers require a declaration from the German delegation within 5 days from the date of this communication that they are prepared to sign the treaty as it stands today. If they declare within this period that they are prepared to sign the treaty as it stands, arrangements will be made for the immediate signature of the peace at Versailles. In default of such a declaration, the armistice will terminate, and the Allied and associated powers will take such steps as they think needful to enforce their terms. There you have it. Woodrow Wilson's grand ideas and idealism for a better world that was coming out of World War I, it will be a different world to be sure. There was no way that that world could go back to what it had been. Humanity would never know the kind of tranquility such as it had known in that period between 1871 and 1914. And to be quite honest, it was a tenuous tranquility. But whatever the good old days were, those days by 1919, they were definitely and absolutely gone. The ferocity of the war meant that now there will be a ferocious peace. And George Clemenceau was making it plain that from the receipt of this note, this communication from him, the Germans had 5 days to sign it, or else, the or else was quite plain. The guns had been silenced, but the threat of war still remained. What were they going to do? Here you see the signing ceremony at Versailles, and the deed was done. It didn't take long at all. It did not take long at all for the narrative, the conspiracy, today we call it conspiracy theory, for the conspiracy theory to arise that the German army had been stabbed in the back. And that stabbing had been done apparently by Jews, a Jewish conspiracy, a Jewish plot. It had no truth in it. But what we have discovered, if we haven't learned anything in our own time, is that truth can be truth, but what's more powerful is what people choose to believe. And people chose to believe that it was a Jewish plot. And because that's what people chose to believe, truth became a matter of, well, it became a matter of being very expendable. In this political cartoon you see right here, it's a 1924 far right-wing German political cartoon showing Philip Scheidemann, the German social democratic politician who proclaimed the Weimar Republic and was its second chancellor. So the fact that Philip Scheidemann was a social democrat, in Germany at the time, to be a social democrat was to be close to the Marxists or the communists or socialists, meaning the Bolsheviks. And Germans absolutely hated the Bolsheviks because they had taken the Russians out of World War I in 1918. So there was that to deal with, ideological differences. So the fact that Philip Scheidemann is a social democrat, in their minds a socialist, means he is doubly guilty. And he's also seen as stabbing the German army in the back. If you look very closely at that picture, you'll see that the soldier down in the trench who appears to be looking back at Scheidemann over his shoulder, he's wearing a swastika on his helmet. We should take note of the fact that this cartoon is from 1924. Please take note that in 1933, a young rising politician named Adolf Hitler had tried to overthrow the government in Bavaria with something known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The Nazis, the National Socialist Party, was already in existence and already at it, trying to overthrow the country. The irony, of course, is that eventually, 10 years later, Paul von Hindenburg, an old World War I soldier, will ask Hitler to assume power in Germany. As they say, you can't make this stuff up. Some have said that it was the Treaty of Versailles that allowed Hitler to come marching into existence, the Hitler Party. Versailles had many things wrong with it. It established a system of mandates created territories of Iraq, Syria, and Transjordan and Palestine that would be ruled over, that would be controlled by the British and the French until the people in those areas, just so we can understand that after 4 years of warfare, the colonizers still had not learned a thing about respecting other people, other religions, other races, other cultures, other histories. So until the people showed that they could govern themselves, they would be mandated, controlled, administered by France and Great Britain. Not a good way to go into the next decade of the 20th century. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would be no more. The new map of Europe looked considerably different than the one that we saw in 1914. Notice, no Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germany, significantly smaller. In Africa, the colonizers will remain, but Germany paid the price in losing its colonies in Africa, which was yet another blow to German pride, German economy, German resources. The war had ended. The dust was settling and the smoke was clearing, but that was not the worst of it. There was something else happening. Let me share that with you. You know, you would think to yourself, the war was so horrible, and it was horrible. But just when things were getting horrible all by itself, this happened. In 1918, the Spanish press, Spanish journalists began reporting about a virus of flu that was spreading across the continent. And because the original reports came from Spain, it was called the Spanish flu. And eventually it made its way all across Europe and around the world and to the United States. And I gotta tell you, the reaction of American leaders and the American people to this flu, like to this virus in 1918, is so astonishingly, it's almost like a rehearsal for the kind of chaos that we see right now. And that includes the chaos of people who don't believe it, the chaos of leadership that failed, the chaos of leadership that's failing, and just the superhuman struggle of people trying to wrap their arms and their minds around this thing that began to affect and then kill so many of their countrymen, so many people that didn't seem like it could be controlled. The stories, the pictures tell the stories. People were ordered to wear masks. And in some communities around the nation, if you didn't wear a mask, you went to jail. I'll let the pictures speak for themselves. It was, I can tell you this much. I studied this before, but revisiting this, people were frightened out of their minds. They just had never seen anything like this. And keep in mind, this is the first pandemic of the 20th century. For 40 years in Europe, of course, things had not been perfect. But on the eve of World War I, nothing like this had happened. People weren't dealing with this. The cost of living was under control. People's standard of living was rising. Europe was dominant in Asia and in Africa. It seemed like civilization had finally reached a point of not perfection, but things had gotten better for more people, and it was getting better for more people on a yearly basis. So people were utterly flabbergasted by, first off, World War I, and then in the midst of the war, while the war is still going on, this happened. It's one thing to fight Germany. It's one thing to fight another nation. But how do you fight a battle when nature is your literal enemy? What do you draw the front line? This pandemic in 1918 affected sports then, just as it's doing today. Schools shut down then, just as schools have been shut down and had to reopen. We're trying to figure out a way to reopen them now. It affected the military back then. It was horrific. And what it did was that people who were suffering from it, especially those who had it really bad, they were said to turn blue and get so dark. I read one report where the doctor said that the people he was treating got so dark that, quite frankly, he could not tell the difference between a white soldier and an African-American soldier. That's how dark they got. And then, of course, their lungs would fill up with fluid and they would drown on land. So people didn't know. And you look at the rudimentary mask. Why does it do that? Give me a second. There we go. Look at the rudimentary mask. They had so much to learn, just like we still have so much to learn about this. Look at this. All theaters closed until further notice at request of the mayor. It's interesting that looking at these pictures, I'm reminded that on the front of the National Archives, where so many of the nation's historical and archaeological treasures are held, there's a sign or an inscription on the front of the National Archives that says the past is prologue, meaning the past is the beginning. And in the case of the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, the past indeed was the beginning, or at least it was a foreshadowing of the crisis that has befallen us, that we are trying to find our way through. So bear with me as I read. The 1918 virus was also a novel virus, meaning it was brand new. Like COVID-19, no one had immunity to it, and it was highly infectious, spreading through respiratory droplets that passed when an infected person coughed or sneezed. Several cities implemented mask mandates. Now, can you imagine if people tried to mandate that today? Several cities implemented mask mandates, describing them as a symbol of wartime patriotism. But some people refused to comply or take them seriously. Again, the past is prologue. The 1918 flu pandemic came in 3 waves. The first wave was in the spring of 1918. The second wave was in the fall of 1918, meaning when the war ended. And then the third wave was in the winter spring of 1919. 50 million people worldwide from 1918 through 1919, including 675,000 Americans, perished. In other words, they estimated that 1/3 of the world's population became infected with the virus. 50 million people, and well over 500,000 Americans, at a time when the world did not have 7 billion people on the planet. The first wave of 1918 came with the usual flu-like symptoms: fever, nausea, body aches, and diarrhea. The second wave was dramatically worse. Rapid spread, killing patients within days or even hours after the symptoms began. The virus caused lungs to fill with fluid. The lack of oxygen made patients' skin turn blue until they suffocated. No vaccine was available. In the US, the pandemic became highly politicized. The past is prologue.
Priceline can save you up to 60% on top hotels.
Oh my God.
They're all great because now is
Memories of the pandemic of 1918 loom over the current global battle against the coronavirus. And though it's too soon to say how comparable the current outbreak will be, there are lessons to be learned from that earlier time, as we hear from Martha Teichner.
The outbreak is growing. More deaths, more cases as thousands of Americans begin to self-quarantine.
If the outbreak of COVID-19 has a bullseye in the U.S., It's Washington State.
Most of those cases are linked to a nursing home outside Seattle.
Schools and universities closed. A gauge of alarm here.
Washington State's death toll continues to rise.
Seen in Seattle, a lot of masks. But not for the first time. Substitute Spanish flu for coronavirus, 1918 for 2020. And just look. Seattle seized by the Godzilla of modern pandemics. The 1918 flu killed 675,000 Americans. 50 to 100 million people died worldwide.
And that's equivalent to 225 to 450 million people today.
That's incredible.
The numbers are staggering.
John Barry wrote a history of the 1918 flu. He is on the adjunct faculty of Tulane University.
There was a mild spring wave that was hit or miss. It came back in the fall with more than a vengeance. Probably 60 to 70% of the deaths actually occurred in an incredibly short time of probably about 14 or 15 weeks.
Really?
From late September 1918 until, through December, maybe a little into January.
In that time, during the final months of World War I, more soldiers died of the flu than were killed on the battlefield during 4 years of fighting. As opposed to the coronavirus, the most vulnerable were in their 20s.
The most horrific symptoms really were you could bleed not only from your nose and mouth, but from your eyes and ears. People were turning so dark blue from lack of oxygen. In the book, I quote one doctor writing a colleague saying that he could not tell white soldiers from African-American soldiers.
It was called the Spanish flu, but that was only because Spain, which was not at war, allowed the press to report on it openly, unlike here. The first serious outbreak in the United States began at Camp Funston, now Fort Riley in Kansas, as infected soldiers from across the country made their way to the trenches in France. The virus spread, but the nation wasn't told. A year earlier, President Woodrow Wilson had rammed through Congress the Sedition Act, making it a crime to say or publish anything negative that would affect the war effort.
Wilson created what was called the Committee for Public Information. The architect of that committee said, "Truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. The force of an idea lies in its inspirational value. It matters very little if it is true or false."
Was that a license to lie to the American public?
It was precisely that. In the United States, you had national public health leaders saying such things as, quote, "This is ordinary influenza by another name," unquote. At the local level, the same kind of thing was occurring.
With deadly consequences, no more so than in Philadelphia, which went ahead with a huge war bond parade in the fall of 1918, when the virus was at its most virulent. Newspapers killed stories, quoting the medical community saying, "Don't do it."
So 48 hours later, influenza exploded around the city. The result is it's one of the hardest hit cities in the world, and the mass graves being dug by steam shovels and so forth.
And how many people died?
About 14,500 in Philadelphia.
Compare the signs that went up then to now. Notice that hand washing wasn't mentioned. Americans could see for themselves in spite of what they were told. They thought they were less likely to catch the flu outside. They did whatever they could, given what they didn't know.
Back in 1918, they had no idea what it was that they were suffering from and what it was that they were being killed by. And to me, that's the most frightening aspect of the 1918 epidemic.
Dr. Jeremy Brown is Director of Emergency Care Research at the National Institutes of Health, but spoke to us in a personal capacity.
Viruses would not be discovered for another 15 or 20 years. That's very different to today. We know what it is that is causing the disease.
Brown has written extensively about influenza and argues that 2020 will not be another 1918, thanks to advances in science.
Back in 1918, the basic treatments that were offered were enemas, whiskey, and bloodletting. Hospitals as we know them today were quite different. There were no intensive care doctors who really understand how to treat the very sickest patients. There were no antibiotics to treat any secondary infection. So it was a very, very different time and a very different way of practicing medicine back then.
But for John Barry, there is a takeaway from then that still applies.
The biggest lesson from the 1918 pandemic is clearly to tell the truth.
What are the consequences if the truth isn't told?
I think more people will die, yeah. Clearly that was the case in 1918. People can deal with the truth. It's the unknown that's much scarier.
Isn't that amazing? Lying leadership, truth obscured, people ignoring the obvious. And the best thing that could have been done for the people in 1918 was to simply tell the truth. And Woodrow Wilson went so far, as you all saw and heard, to pass legislation to stop people from speaking out against it. So add to that a violation or at least an ignoring of people's First Amendment rights to speak freely. Well, it passed as prologue.
Priceline can save you up to 60% on top hotels. And when you save up to 60%,
Let's play.
you're always a winner.
You got up to 60% of your.
How I hate YouTube
Memories of
sometimes.
the
So the mask wearing would continue all the way into 1919. And this is a picture of a young girl who was looking at her mother, I believe that is. She eventually called somebody from the Red Cross to come and they saved that woman's life. The Great War ended, and as you saw from that last video clip, the pandemic did not recognize that the war had ended. The pandemic, quite frankly, didn't care. The pandemic didn't know to care. The Great War ended, and then came the second wave.
I had a little bird. I heard the window and influenza.
Perhaps until recently, Spanish flu has been what some people call a forgotten pandemic. But it was a huge global calamity. In terms of the number of deaths, we're saying 50 to 100 million, far greater than the casualties of the First World War. Roughly around April, May 1918, when, the carnage of the First World War is graphic and horrendous. But at the same time, this unknown enemy is starting to sweep through the US, Europe, the trenches. And it is recorded by the Spanish press, and it becomes dubbed as the Spanish flu, because they are neutral. Well, at the time in the 1920s, they estimated that maybe 20 million had died. By the late 20th century, that figure had been up to 25 million. In the 21st century, with scientists and historians now getting together to work much more closely, that figure has now been upped to 50 to 100 million people killed. This virus killed more people in the first 25 weeks than HIV/AIDS has killed in 25 years. Horrendous. And those mortality statistics are staggering.
We don't know exactly why some flu strains are much more severe than others and why some of them would be more likely to kill people or cause very severe disease.
What is particular about avian and pandemic viruses is that they replicate deep inside our lungs. When our cells detect this and trigger a very strong innate immune response, this leads to an influx of white blood cells and fluids into our lungs, and it restricts the amount of airspace that we have to breathe.
The symptoms are very graphic and very, very striking. So, it's said that some people drowned in their own phlegm. So if it was hitting or affecting the lungs, people were spurting blood from their ears and their noses. Descriptions of people turning blue or purple. So, you know, it was really, really severe, and people just dropping down in the streets. Those that succumbed to the flu were in the age group 20 to 40 years, which is very unusual for an influenza epidemic or pandemic. And scientists and historians are now still looking to see why.
There's really two ways that people died in 1918. They either died from the initial flu infection, or they died from an enormously strong immune response to that virus, where their lungs just filled up with fluids from trying to attack the virus that got into their lungs.
So traditionally, everyone sort of said, oh, well, it's the trenches, you know, the conditions of the war, and that's why it was so fatal. But then you think, well, you know, how did it spread so rapidly around the world to places that are not part of the theatre of war? I think the traditional explanation is it starts in Kansas, in an army camp, and then the troops bring it over to the trenches, Europe. But there's still many, many unknowns.
So mathematical modelers have long been interested in the 1918 pandemic. And one of the questions is to try and disentangle how it spread around the world and exactly what the routes have been. Given perfect data, you could work backwards and try to infer where it's come from. Whereabouts does it arrive in a country? Does it arrive multiple times? Or thinking about multiple countries, where is the first place? If you understand the origin of a pandemic, then you understand something about where it's come from, and maybe you can stop that in future.
Almost certainly it was a bird flu originally. But then we also know that that flu, or something very similar to it, was in pigs at the same time. Maybe it's somebody who works very closely with birds, or who works very closely with pigs, or has some other exposure like that. One of the big, really open questions in flu research and flu public health is, how does the virus adapt from one species to another? How does, for example, a virus in pigs or in birds get into humans and then start transmitting? Then the key question is, how does the virus then adapt within that person to stop being a pig virus or a bird virus and become a human virus? In other words, to be able to transmit from human to human. And it's probably some very quick evolutionary process that is going on within that human. And in many cases, won't be successful, but in a few cases will. And that's when the virus can start spreading between humans and become a flu pandemic, and then stay in humans as regular seasonal flu.
Just as people were celebrating Armistice Day, and there was hope that it was dying down, but then it resurged, and a far more deadly and virulent strain emerged. So this second wave really spread like wildfire, affecting a third or quarter of the population of the world. And it was short-lived, so it petered out not long afterwards, maybe 1920, 1921, but it was in the sense short-lived.
What happened is that virus continued to transmit among humans. In fact, it continued until 1957 to transmit between humans. And probably what happened there is that the virus adapted to humans. It wasn't this avian or swine virus that came in and was accidentally more pathogenic in humans. In our lab here in Cambridge, we study both seasonal flu and pandemic flu from the standpoint of, how does the virus evolve? And how can we predict that evolution and make vaccines to try to artificially evolve the virus, both in the laboratory and in the computer, to understand what it's going to do next, and to make vaccines against those strains that will evolve in the future. So this is the basic science of studying evolution and trying to predict that evolution, something that nobody's ever been able to do for a complex organism. And then working to use that understanding to make better vaccines. On the pandemic flu side, we do a similar thing where we look to see how that virus is changing, that virus, how it changes in birds, and how it changes in, how that virus changes in other species, and to try to see what possible variants out there might be. And again, to make vaccines that could protect against all of those variants that we see.
Flu is very difficult.
The good news is that today, unlike in 1918, we understand vaccines. We have a lot more knowledge about germ theory. Germ theory exists. So we have science to work from. There's a little bit more left of that, but we're start close to running out of time, and I wanted to make sure we have some time for some Q&A about any one of the 4 parts. So I'll go ahead and stop the screen share now and be able to take you all's questions.
Okay, Fred, so I have a couple things in the chat. The first is just that, so our nonfiction book group read Barry's Great Influenza recently, which apparently states that the Spanish flu began in Kansas and was spread to Europe by American troops, that other countries in the conflict did not print any bad news for reasons of morale, but Spanish were non-combatants, and so their newspapers reported on it. And then a second one that they believed that, or thought the flu outbreak in 1918 also started in Kansas. And that it was the primary cause for the end of the war.
Right. And from what I know of that, I got to go back and I lost my copy of Barry's book, so I got to order another one. But just like today, Kim, they're talking about species jumping. That for the current one that started in Wuhan, apparently, in Wuhan, China, that they thought initially they thought it jumped from a bat to a human being, or because in those what do they call them, those wet markets in China, and the wet markets they have throughout Asia. I guess you could say they have them. There's some American communities, you find them as well, but it's one of the things they thought it jumped from. What they, generally speaking, species jumping. And in this case, in the Kansas example, it would have been from a swine type of virus that jumped to a human being. And then with American troops going overseas, that's how it spread. So the theory was. And apparently Barry narrowed that down.
Okay. Another person saying, I've heard the flu may have been responsible for the failure of the last German advance. Is there any truth to that?
I've read that, there's been all kinds of attribution given to how the virus imperiled the Allied effort during World War I, how it affected the Germans. And I've read too many conflicting reports that it certainly had an impact, but not enough to determine or change what eventually became the outcome of the war anyway. The Germans were pretty much done by the time the virus began to have its significant effect.
Okay. Another one from John and Shay Cobes. On Wilson's 14 points, number 4 and 5 were identical. Were there only 13 or was one missing?
I got to go back and look. Let me see. Number 4 and 5, let me see. Number 4 was adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. And number 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. Let me look at the actual PowerPoint that I used, because it might be that chart too. Number 4, reduce the military forces, and or weapons. Good catch, John. That chart has number 4 and 5 being the same. Number 4 and 5 were different. By the way, half scholars, this is why I love you guys. My students don't care enough to tell me I'm wrong.
Oh, believe me, yes. Let's see. I have someone asking if there are any books you would recommend concerning World War I, for people who would like to learn more and read more about the war.
Well, let me deal with that last question. So,
okay.
Point number 4 on the 14 points: adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. In other words, what Wilson wanted was to have all of the participants at Versailles agree to have militaries and navies that wouldn't have armies beyond what they considered necessary for their national security, as we would phrase it today. Because again, before the war, there had been this arms race where their militaries had significantly outstripped the practical necessity, so it was thought, for what a nation would have needed for their self-defense. And then point number 5 on the 14 points would have been a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. So a lot of this language trending toward diplomacy, respecting territorial sovereignty, respecting territorial claims, and not imposing oneself upon somebody else. In other words, all the things that people have been doing that brought World War I on, Wilson's addressing all those. Of course, it's too late to start the war, but he's trying to prevent another one, of course. Now, as far as books go, I recommend, it's a nonfiction book. By the time I mentioned to you While Generals Die in Bed, of course, All Quiet on the Western Front is always a good one. I really recommend that documentary that Peter Jackson made about 2-3 years ago. I think is They Shall Not Grow Old. It's where Peter Jackson, the guy who made the Lord of the Rings series, his grandfather apparently, or his great-grandfather, served in World War I and just talked about it a lot. Peter Jackson said when he grew up, he heard a lot about his relative's service in World War I, so he's always been fascinated with the war. So what he did was he took the considerable resources he had as a movie maker and the considerable skill that he had as a movie maker. He went back to the British Imperial War Museum and to London and got all this archival footage that had been stored for 100 or more years. He remastered it, colorized it. They hired lip readers and linguists, because people are, it's in the early 20th century. So the movies, what they call the silent movies. So people are talking, but of course they didn't have the technology to hear what people are saying. So these lip readers were able to figure out what these guys were saying in the film. And then they literally voiced over what they were saying. Then they added sound effects. And that documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old, is about as good an historical piece on World War I as I have ever seen.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. I'm going to work my way from the bottom. From Karen, did Wilson get the influenza while negotiating the Treaty of Versailles and lose his ability to continue with his original agenda of no blame, no shame?
I am not aware. I don't think, no, Wilson did not succumb. Ironically enough, Wilson did not succumb to the virus, even though he didn't tell the truth about it. And then, of course, passed that sedition legislation that prevented others from telling the truth about it. Now, what eventually happened to Woodrow Wilson is that he suffered a stroke, a pretty devastating stroke, and his second wife, Edith Bowling Galt, for the remainder of his presidency, she ran the government. She ran the executive branch. Edith Bowling Galt, she was no joke. She basically saved his presidency, such as that which was left to be saved.
What a woman.
Yes.
From Sue, John Barry suggests in his book that Germany was talking about ending the war, but once Wilson was started to get into the war, he wanted a complete win rather than a treaty. Do you agree?
Woodrow Wilson is a paradox. Well, in some ways, he's not a paradox. He's pretty much, his record on race in the United States is pretty dismal. The Germans definitely did put out some feelers, and they were trying to just like toward the end of World War II, where you had some people in the Nazi high command that were at least beginning to speak amongst themselves in very hushed tones about the coming end that everybody could see. But it's true that as World War I was coming to a close, that there were people inside of the Imperial German government who saw which way the wind was blowing, and they contacted the Allies to see what kind of a best peace deal they could get. Now, as far as Wilson wanting a complete total win, I just have to go back and look at that. That's what they eventually got, and that, of course, is what the Allies wanted, especially the French. Wilson's motivation, if you listen to everything he said, so much of what he talked about, he was going there definitely as a victorious president, but he also had this idea of a new world order that would be a lot more fair, a lot more equitable. And in foreign policy circles, Wilson is generally cast as being somebody who was an idealist. He sincerely believed that we could, have this League of Nations, sit down and talk through our problems. Well, that works to a point, but clearly it didn't work well enough. Priscilla's asking, can we get the number 5 correction for the 14-point chart? Let me call that back up.
While you're doing that, I have another person that says she read Woodrow Wilson caught the flu and that his resulting weakness affected his attempt to push his League of Nations agenda.
I'll look into it, Kim.
Okay.
That's an opportunity for me to read. Where is that? Oh, here it is. So point number 5. Let me share my screen. I'll put point number 5 up here.
Okay.
On this other. I use that other one because it actually had the chart. And this is one that I created. All right.
Perfect, thanks.
See, point number 4, adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. Number 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely, look at the language here. A free as opposed to not free, open-minded as opposed to closed-minded, and absolutely impartial as opposed to partial adjustment of all colonial claims. So this is great forward thinking, but the problem with it is that he's still talking about colonial claims, not abolishing or getting rid of the colonies. And of course, the people in those colonies in World War II, after that war ends, the very thing they're going to do, they're going to demand independence. But in any case, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight. In other words, the colonial subjects, their interests must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. So the colonizers are being told that they had to first recognize the rights of the colonized, which was probably not going to happen, given that those colonies were in Africa for the most part and in Asia secondarily, but then that the colonizers basically had to agree to the demise of their colonies. That's an act of human kindness and goodness that was simply too much asking of people in the early 20th century from France, Germany, and Britain especially.
Okay.
So move ahead. Number 6, the evacuation of all Russian territory and such settlement. This is because the British and the Americans had sent expeditions into Russia to fight against the Bolsheviks during the Civil War. Number 7, Belgium, the whole world will agree, must be evacuated and restored without attempt to limit the sovereignty which she enjoys in common with all other free nations. Recall that the Belgians, their territory had been violated when Germany had enacted the Schlieffen Plan at the very beginning of World War I. It was marching through Belgium that moved the British to make good on their pledge to protect Belgian sovereignty. And then what happened in Belgium soon after the war started was such a horrific escapade that somebody named Herbert Hoover eventually left his job as an engineer and organized an international effort to bring food and resource relief to Belgian civilians who were just, up until then, in the early 20th century, with all this sort of being brand new for the first time, at least on that scale, people must have been aghast at what the Germans were doing to Belgian civilians. Now, needless to say, by the end of the war, humanity will have adjusted to that. But in the early days, what the Germans did to the Belgians was it was just incomprehensible. Number 8, then number 9, a readjustment of Italy's frontiers. You can see it goes down to numbers 10, 11, 12, 13, and of course, the biggest one, the 14th point, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. I will double check for myself the relationship between Wilson, the flu, and his ability to push through the negotiations on the 14th point. But we need to keep in mind that irrespective of what Wilson wanted and how he was feeling, George Clemenceau was absolutely not going to allow the Germans to get off the hook. And eventually, what eventually killed Wilson's dream of the League of Nations, at least America's participation in it, was the United States Senate. You know, that body that's always reliable and does what we want.
Huh. Okay, Tom is asking, why did Germany agree to an armistice when the Allies hadn't penetrated into Germany? And was the fact that World War I was not fought on German soil a factor in spreading the myth that Germany was stabbed in the back by the Jews?
There had been some penetration of German soil, not to the extent that it had been in France, but this is also why the Germans had been sending out feelers to the Allies to try and bring as much of a good deal in the peace arrangements as possible, because they didn't want to be invaded. So they were trying to maintain that territorial integrity. And to show what happened is that in the post-war world, as I showed you all that map, there were parts of Germany, the Rhineland, the Saar, Alsace-Lorraine, that Germany claimed that were dominated by the Allied powers, specifically France. And indeed, during the post-war years, when the Germans were showing some difficulty in paying reparations, the French did occupy German territory for a time. Now, the idea of this conspiracy theory about this notion of being stabbed in the back, you got to go back in German history and just appreciate the Prussian military tradition. The German military, unlike the American military in our history, we have not always had such an esteemed view of people in uniform. For a long, long time, up until, frankly, even up to World War II, America had, and before World War I, America had basically a frontier force. Our military was there just as it wasn't an army of a superpower or even a great power. World War I, of course, changed all that. World War II would radically change all that. So the American military, with its relationship with the civilian population, has always been one where you kind of get this kind of suspicious side eye. Whereas in Germany, all the way back to the time of Frederick the Great, the military, the Prussian tradition, the Prussian military tradition, it was seen as something that was honorable, something that was good to be a part of. The Germans really took great pride in their history and their association of the military and the role of the military in that history. Now, the United States will change that viewpoint after World War II, and especially after Vietnam, when we have our servicemen and women coming back from Vietnam, those 17 to 19-year-old kids who, especially ones who were drafted, who just went there and did their duty. Nobody that I know, Vietnam veteran that I ever talked to actually wanted to go, but they went anyway. And this is why today we have such a cozy relationship, a warmer relationship with our military, and we say, thank you for your service. Mm-hmm. So I say all that just to say, with the prominence that the German military had in German society and German culture, and the strength of the Prussian military tradition, and the fact that if you look at a picture of the Kaiser who always wore that spiked helmet, the idea of the German military being stabbed in the back by Jews and social democrats or communists was just a lie too good to not be told. And when it took off, it just couldn't be stopped. And obviously, the Nazis made great use of that lie in coming to power.
Okay. Question from Ben regarding, was the League of Nations a forerunner of the UN?
Many people have said that it was. In fact, as a matter of fact, then I'll say yes to that, because toward the end of World War II, when Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were talking about the post-war world, the one thing that they said that the United Nations would be the corrective antidote to what had failed in the League of Nations. So yes, it was.
Okay. And then this is a question from Ralph and Linda, which might be a whole nother course, but could you please talk about the link between the Treaty of Versailles and the conflict in Vietnam?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. At Versailles, attending the Versailles conference, there was a gentleman named Ho Chi Minh. Ever heard of him?
Mm-hmm.
Ho Chi Minh was the leader, became the leader of North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and a delegation of Vietnamese tried to meet with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had been doing a lot of talking about the self-determination of all peoples around the world and small countries being treated with the same kind of fairness and equity that large countries had. So Ho Chi Minh, that was music to his ears. He never got a chance to meet with Woodrow Wilson. And of course, in the following years, Wilson was not able to get, Wilson was not even able to get the American Senate to agree to ratify America's participation in the Treaty of Versailles. And Versailles clearly failed the Vietnamese people because the French did not back off of colonization. The British never backed off of colonization. So it was the failure at Versailles and Ho Chi Minh's subsequent disillusionment with that failure that eventually pushed him further into his identity as a nationalist as well as a communist. I do not want to diminish the fact that Ho Chi Minh was a committed Marxist, if you want to put it like that. But as we discovered soon enough in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh was probably more than a communist. He was a nationalist. And we need to remember that in Vietnamese history, the Vietnamese have fought the Chinese on several occasions and they have won. They fought the French colonizers, then they fought the Japanese, then they fought the French again after World War II. Then of course they fought the Americans. So the one consistent thing about Ho Chi Minh was he was willing to fight, and it didn't really matter who the opponent was. His objective was, I want you out of my country. So he was definitely a nationalist.
Awesome. I think this is the last question from Tina. Can you understand why the French were more interested in revenge considering how much war damage they suffered?
It was because of that war damage that they had suffered. That's why they wanted revenge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, during the interwar period, the French were going to build something called a Maginot Line. It's a very, very complex and sophisticated series of bunkers and machine gun emplacements and artillery emplacements and ditches and trenches and barbed wire, all for the simple purpose, all for the possibility that if warfare broke out again in Europe, as surely the French must have suspected that it might, that if the Germans decided to come France's way again, they would meet that Maginot Line. Who could have predicted that in 1940, when the Nazis launched their offensive against France, that the Wehrmacht, supported by a fantastic tool called the Luftwaffe of the German Air Force, that they would get to the Maginot Line and really drive around it. The French had good cause to be worried about a second war with Germany. And it was because the French had been so savaged by the German army during World War I that they're kind of victor's justice. Fast forward to World War II. What the Germans did to the Russian people in that conflict, it's why when German soldiers who were wounded and were sent back to Germany from the Eastern Front, they were ordered not to say anything about the actual truth of what's going on in Russia, because it was understood by those who whispered it. You know, as soldiers talked to their sweethearts, their wives, their families, Germans slowly came to understand that if the Russian army ever did to the German citizens, had visited the hell upon them, that the Wehrmacht and the Schutzstaffel and the Einsatzgruppen had imposed upon the Russian people, there was going to be hell to pay. And as it was, when the Russians came to Germany, they were in a tremendously bad mood. And those German civilians, they were right to be afraid because the Russians took out some savage revenge based upon what had happened to them inside of the Soviet Union.
Okay. We have a very nice thank you to you for sharing so much knowledge and time with us. And then we also have someone asking if you could pull the scary quote up again from Stalin about elections.
Oh, sure. Let me see. Yeah. Yeah, Stalin was as they say, Stalin was a piece of work.
Yeah.
So here's the quote. Wait a minute. Thank you, Priscilla. Share screen. Here we go. I was reading the quote, but I forgot you all couldn't see it. Here are the quotes from Stalin. It is enough that the people know there was an election. The people who cast the votes decide nothing. The people who count the votes decide everything.
Eek.
Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? Death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problem. You know, just the kind of guy you want running your country.
Right.
You know, we should not be at all surprised, based on these statements alone, that Joseph Stalin engineered the largest man-made famine of the 20th century against the Ukrainians. I think, what's it called? The Holodomor, where 3 to 12 million Ukrainians were starved to death because he wanted to collectivize their farms. Look, there's a reason why people should be afraid of socialism. All right. Theoretically, it sounds wonderful. All cooperation, we all get along, whatnot. But in order for that to be true, we'd all have to get along. We don't. And so because of that, when people are talking about we want to collectivize your farm, every person's going to say, well, why mine? Why not his? Are you going to collectivize everybody's? According to what? What rules? Who's going to get paid? All that kind of stuff. Those are the kind of things that the Marxists never fully work out. And that's why it has always ended up being a disaster. So even though it sounds nice, and even though it might be a better word if you could actually make it happen, it's never going to happen because of the inherent brutality required to make it become a reality. And here, and this finally, you know, Marxism is based upon this notion that finally, sooner or later, probably sooner than later, we're going to learn to get along and be friends and love each other. Well, let me put it to you like this. I have been saying recently that I work for, my boss is a Jewish carpenter. And once upon a time, he said, you should love your neighbor as yourself. Seeing as to how we have spectacularly failed at that, I'm not holding my breath that Karl Marx's ideas are going to take root anytime soon and be successful. And that's all I'll say about that.
Amen. All right. Well, it's 11:07, so I am going to let y'all go. Let's say thank you. I'm so sad these weeks are done.
I'm going to miss you guys. I'm going to miss you guys because I'm telling you, my students don't care enough about me to tell me that I'm wrong. You all do.
Those were some tough questions. My goodness. I will remind you that Fred is doing 2 sessions of great decisions for us. Fred, remind you that one's on China and what's the other one?
I think the other one's on the Philippines.
Yep. So those are coming up yet this semester.
And 2 more things to look forward to. On January 5, Fred is going to be speaking to the HASP General Meeting, January 5. And the title is, I think that's the one called The America's Tortured Soul. Is that correct?
Yes,
Fred?
yes.
Okay, and then he will also be teaching.
Reconstruction.
Yeah. He will also be teaching the history of the Black church sometime next term. We don't know yet, but that's on our docket as well.
It's a course that I taught. It's a course. The history of the Black church is a course that I taught for Western Theological Seminary this past summer, and it was very well received. And people told me that they had never heard the information. And I said to these folks, I said, you know what? You are about to be ministers of Word and Sacrament. You can't afford to not have this information. You really can't. So I'm anxious to teach it.
Well, thank you.
You guys are so great. Thank you, Kit, for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kit.
Thank you, Fred.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
You too.
Get out and enjoy the sun today.
Yep.
Be sure to vote.
Yes, be sure to vote.
Rake your leaves.
And come rake mine. Bye, everybody.